So just to begin, I'd like to share a bit about myself. So I'm a product designer and I'm currently based in KL. I've actually, over the past few years, I've lived and worked across London, KL, and Brunei, and now I'm back in KL. So I'm currently working at a fintech startup called Paid, and my background actually began in industrial design, and then I picked up some marketing and learned about that, and then eventually found myself doing UX, UI work and web development. And ever since then, I've just been working on that pretty much. So without further ado, I'll share about my project. So just to begin, how many of you have actually had the pleasure of traveling during COVID-19, like in the past year or so? Maybe you can just type this in the chat. The tab can see. Oh no, you didn't get to go Gaddafi? No. Yeah, so I would assume most of us didn't get the chance to go traveling. I don't know if I want to say fortunately or not, but I did manage to go to Singapore a few months ago for my cousin's wedding, when just before when travel restrictions were still in place before everything started opening up. So basically, at the time I was still living in Brunei, and then I had a trip to go to Singapore for my cousin's wedding. So this is when, like, back in restrictions and short, but again, there were still restrictions from both. And just for some of you to know, how I prepared for this trip was actually something like this. It's a bit overkill with this Excel sheet, but there were a ton of requirements that I needed just to go for a 2-hour trip away. So creating this list took me about 2 to 3 hours, and I had to read through quite a number of government websites and documents just to find out what I actually needed. Yeah, so, and I hope none of you would have had to go through that. So as another simplified version of this looks something like this. So in order to depart Brunei, I need permission from the Prime Minister's office to exit. Basically, I need my COVID vaccine, I need insurance, pre-departure COVID test, and for that to enter Singapore, I then need another PCR on arrival, Singapore arrival form, and some other things like that. And then, as well as that, you had to do it 2 times. So another time for departing Singapore. So I need another pre-departure PCR, and then another PCR on arrival, 7 days quarantine. Honestly, it was such a hectic thing for just like a 2-hour flight. So hopefully none of you have had to go through that. And just a bit more context, and in case anybody wanted to know, this is what all those documents look like. So these were compiled from like quite a number of government websites, all prepared to go for my trip to Singapore. So yeah, that was pretty much everything I needed. And I had to do this for my family as well, as I was the designated travel. I do all these things most of the time. Yeah. So just when I thought everything was going smoothly, one of my documents from the Brunei side actually got delayed, which was the permission of exiting the country, basically. So while that took, I only received that document about 2 days before my flight. But the problem was that one of my other documents to enter Singapore was, I applied for that 1 day late, because that one you can only apply for that up to 3 days before your flight. But I only got exit approval 2 days before. So that caused quite a bit of hectic on my side. But because without this document, I would have not been allowed to enter Singapore and possibly face risk of deportation and not being allowed to enter Singapore in the near future, which were a bit scary if you ask me. So even my cousin on his side, he tried to call the ICA, but they weren't having any of it. Were saying like, oh, you should just try planning better next time. So that's unfortunately what happened. But ultimately, I just had to reapply for a new exit permit. Thankfully, I managed to get it in a day, and had to re-update all my documents. And I even had to buy a brand new plane ticket, which was very, very expensive. So that cost like $1,000. So 3K RM for a new ticket last flight. So hopefully none of you will ever have to go through such conundrums like this, I hope. But ultimately I managed to get to Singapore in the end, see my cousin's wedding, and happy ever after. But this experience got me thinking, who else in a similar position? So looking into the news, we can see that I'm not the only one, actually. So there have been cases of a couple of Malaysians trying to enter Germany um, because their vaccines weren't accepted. I think they were using Sinopharm, but some countries did not accept it as form of vaccination, which I know that sucks, but that's what you get given. You don't exactly get a choice. And then on the other side of things, in Europe, about 100 British tourists got denied entry to Austria because of this, because some information mixed up on their side, on the travel website. So again, it looks like I'm not the only one facing these kind of travel issues. So with this, so then this came in mind to with this problem. I thought let's try and do something about this. So what if we could make planning overseas travel easier to prepare in Southeast Asia? So this was essentially be my brief for this project that I worked on. So to begin, I looked and reviewed what was my traveling process. So essentially, a huge part of that trip was planning for the travel. So it would involve reading entry requirements, exit requirements, what vaccination would be accepted, checking the types of COVID tests that I had to do, any quarantine, things like that, and of course that are involved in this. And then once all of those have been actually identified, it was then a stage of obtaining those documents in the first place, in the next place. So that meant I have to actually print some of them out or fill them on or go to a hospital to get a PCR test, etc., just to get the documents. And then that finally led to the traveling stage, which is honestly the easiest part of all this, but also it's part of putting trust into the fact that your preparation would have paid off well in that. So, what does the planning process look like? In a bit more detail, it's basically it will start off with something like how to enter Singapore. So Google Singapore entry requirements. You'll be brought to a government website, and then you read the entry requirements. From there, it might diverge into like 3 or 4 subsections, and then you'll get redirected to another page, another microsite, and then you have to prepare and compile all of that and repeat it for any other areas that you need to read. So for some people, this can be quite intimidating as there's quite a lot of text. And while this flow looks quite linear, quite straightforward, in reality, you're basically reading all these big chunks of documents like this. So walls of text, lots of subheadings, subpoints, lots of details that you have to read thoroughly to make sure you don't mess up like me, unfortunately. So those were the things that would happen in reality. So as part of my research, I actually reached out to some individuals I knew who did travel during the COVID period. So some of them said the information on the websites weren't clear, or it was felt outdated, or it didn't feel like it came from a trusted source. And just like them, they were also a designated travel agent person like I would have been for my family. And then from another person who went to Singapore in March of 2021, there were lots of rules and regulations, and they felt very overwhelmed when trying to prepare for their trip. But after they arrived, it felt like it was nothing, same like when I did when I entered Singapore. And then finally, with another person who traveled to Brunei end of 2021 or early 2022, sometimes the information comes from the airlines themselves, but sometimes if you ask them directly, they don't even know themselves. So everyone's kind of looking at different sources, or they're not quite sure what's the most up-to-date, etc. So this would be how I look at creating the solution, like a single source of section where everyone can just check this kind of information, ideally. So this then led to the creating a impact chart like this. So trying to see which ideas would stick well with low impact. So ideally, we want the ones with low effort, high impact, of course. So the one that I ultimately decided on was a checklist of documents required. The easiest thing that could have been done was to re-upload that Excel sheet that I made earlier, as you know, all the information is already there. But the problem was collecting that information in the first place would have been quite manual and tedious to having to read all those points one by one. So this is what I ended up deciding on building for the project. So this then led to me doing some wireframe and testing. So I did some quick, easy wireframes and sketched them in my book, and then built them on FigJam. It was quite simple, nothing too complex. Added some text for some context as well, and then brought that over to Figma itself. Tested it out, got some feedback on that. So while people did actually like the prototype that I showed, they would have preferred more some actual specific details. For example, physical directions on finding things like where test centers are or where to turn when they arrive at the airport, things like that. So it's a bit more immersive in that sense. So after a few more rounds of iteration back and forth and testing, ultimately I led to this, which I call Seesaw. So the idea is that it's a seesaw. It brings you up and down across seesaw. Anyone get it? All right. And just for the sake of the project, I wanted to keep the UI and branding as simple as possible, just because the main focus of this project would be the information itself rather than the graphics or the visuals or anything pretty like that. So I also decided to use a color scheme inspired by airport wayfinding, actually. So if you notice, a lot of airports use like yellow as the main accent color, and then it's contrasted against like a dark black or a navy blue, just so that you know where the information is, where to look at. So you know it's like very informative, which is what led to this design choice. So in a nutshell, this is what the this is what Seesaw does. So you can check travel restrictions for entry.
Dude, so sorry.
All good.
He locked me out just now. That's why I can't go back.
Oh
So that was
no,
a question from Yewa just now.
where is it?
So the question you answered just now is actually from Yewa.
Oh, I
So
see, I see.
yeah, because I couldn't log back in just now. That's why I just post Yewa's question first before I log back
Sure,
in.
sure,
Yep. All right. Anyone else? Okay. So another question from Melissa as well. So
sure, sure.
Melissa was asking, is it equally important to try to squeeze in some user testing despite chasing against time for a simpler MVP? Or is
Mm.
it all right to just continue to test after development and launch?
Okay, great question there. I think definitely get user feedback on this, because I think the last thing you want is to build something that users end up not liking, so or not end up wanting or using in the first place. So would have wasted time in development stages. So I think if you can build it as simple as possible, it doesn't need to be a Figma mockup or wireframe sometimes. Even paper or just explaining the concept might be enough to get some feedback.
Okay.
Yeah,
Right. Does that answer your question, Melissa? If you have follow up, feel free to ask in general as well.
yeah,
Now,
yeah.
there's also a third one from
Yep.
Azim
Mhm.
Hasnan. So, were there any
Yep.
other stakeholders, or is this your personal project?
This one is a personal project that I worked on. While I did show this to some other, while I showing it to some users, some of them were telling me, "Hey, would you like to show this to the government or something like that?" For me, when holders like that get involved, that's when it gets a bit messy, and then actual requirements come in and regulations, etc. So this one was mostly a personal project.
Hmm. Okay, that's great. I do have a question for myself since there is none. There's no fourth questions. For you, right? When you first started this project, were you expecting it to end after if COVID restrictions has been
Yeah.
lifted and then everyone goes back to normal?
Mm. How I looked at it, I mean, me and my friend, we worked on this together. I think initially it was supposed to be showing COVID restrictions, what documents you need, etc. But I think even if COVID were to go away and things go back to normal, I think there is still some value in it. Could be like e-visa requirements or filling in documents all in one platform rather than having to go to multiple areas to do it. So more of like an all-in-one platform.
I see. So it needs iteration for that
Yeah.
situation. All right.
Yes,
All right.
exactly. And then yeah,
Yeah. Got it. Got it.
yeah,
So we have another question from Eric Wong. So what
sure.
are the features that you would improve if you were to continue on this project? It sounds like the follow up from my question as well. That's good. Yeah.
Okay, cool, cool. So for me, I think if I were to improve on this project, definitely look at how I can scale up a lot more. Because the reason, if you notice, this project was actually specifically for Southeast Asia. Because when I was doing research on making it global, once you start adding multiple countries in, the scale of requirements just grows exponentially. So I think designing it in a way where it can work with as many countries as possible would be the next challenge. So the easiest thing, I guess right now when it was designed, there were easy ways to categorize it. There was the quarantine, there was insurance, and there was COVID. What do you call COVID's type of vaccine, and the documents. So some countries might even have things that go outside of these four regular things, which that have not been taken into account for.
I guess
Yeah.
there's actually another question. I'm not sure whether uh, whether Azim actually answered your question as well, Yiwa. So Yiwa's question is actually how many countries you have planned on launching in the beginning. Did you
Uh,
collect all necessary docs and information vary according to the countries?
yeah. Initially, it was planned for just Southeast Asia, as I think that would have kept it at a manageable size at the start. So I looked into mostly Malaysia, Brunei, and Singapore. So the rest I haven't done yet, but that would have been
So it's within these three things. Okay. But from your experience doing Malaysia, Brunei, and Singapore, how different are they in terms of documentation and the things that you need to actually provide inside the app itself?
Yeah, thankfully it was mostly similar. As I mentioned before, you can categorize it into mostly four types of buckets. So first one would have been the type of COVID vaccination that you need. Second is the actual entry documents, like for example, Singapore requires SG arrival. Malaysia would have required My Sejahtera. You can fill it in the app there, and then Brunei would have required an form. So that's what you could categorize as entry forms. And then for quarantine like that, it's all the same, or it would have been accordingly depending on the country. And then finally, there was what was it? Finally, they would have. Let me check what was it. Oh yeah, and then there was PCR/ART arrival. So depending whether you need PCR before or on arrival or ART like that.
I see. All right. So I think there's actually one more question from Azim. I also think Azim technically answered as well. Um, so Azim Hassan was asking, do you foresee the pandemic restriction would last longer than what it turned out currently during the production of the design and production of your app?
To be honest, I was quite surprised that these restrictions got dropped as early as April or like around April, March. Because I think I was expecting it to probably taper off maybe later towards the year, like September around that time. So I think that the fact that it's taken a step in this direction is good for everyone else. But the project itself is another thing. But yeah, definitely a good step forward.
I see. I see. So I think one more question from me before we go on a 5 minutes break, everyone. So before we transition to Galavi's session as well, is that for in when you begin this project, right? What
Mm.
is your goal? Is it trying to solve this particular restriction problem, or is it something that you think it's a long term thing that you want to grow?
I think initially idea of this project was to help people plan their travels better so they know what documents they need, they know what restrictions, and can travel confidently. So that was the main goal of the project. So looking into that, I think on a basic level, it does need a lot more potential to do more than just that, of course. So like e-visas or apply for other documents required to enter another country, etc. So in those aspects, that's what it could be used for, rather than just saying like amount of days you need this vaccination or things like that. So that's how I would see it.
All right, got it. Now, I actually, unfortunately, we can't answer everyone's question. If you have actually additional one, we are actually past almost reached exactly 10 minutes for this Q&A session. So once again, thanks Azim for your presentation. It was actually short, clear, and very precise as well. And also, this is something that I would want to highlight as well from Azim's presentation is that besides creating simple and straightforward UI, one thing that is actually quite important is actually usability testing and also user research, which you can see inside his presentation as well. A lot of people don't actually do that. when you try to go fast, but doing that gives you a lot more insight on what the user actually wants. So that's actually a very important thing besides creating very aesthetically pleasing user interfaces. Yep. So having that said that, thanks again, Azim.